An FBI investigation, a billion-dollar budget deficit, and the governor suggesting bankruptcy as a solution. Chicago Public Schools is a district in disarray. What's next for teachers, parents, and students? A ticket instead of jail time for marijuana users. Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez wants low-level drug offenders to get treatment, not jail time. She says police, courts, and corrections should focus on major crimes, not minor marijuana offenses.
It's just so common, it really does need to be decriminalized.
Saying goodbye to Francis Cardinal George. Chicago's Archbishop passed away Friday after a long battle with cancer. He was 78. Chicago area Catholics spent this week paying their respects.
I think he really did try to do his best to bring the best of the gospel to the people of Chicago.
And it's not just for Thanksgiving anymore. Pumpkin is on its way to becoming the official Illinois state pie, beating out blueberry and sweet potato. The measure passed the House 108-3 and now heads to the Senate, where voters hope the sweetness continues.
Well, it's nice to know they can find something to agree on, and maybe that's a good start. But I would vote for apple pie myself.
Apple has my vote, too. Joining us tonight to discuss all this and more are author and attorney Shermeen Cruz, Lorraine Forte, editor-in-chief for Catalyst Chicago, and Caitlin Wilson, staff writer for Reboot Illinois. Hello and welcome to you all.
Hello. Thank you.
We'll start with the big troubles for CPS. The district moved to suspend its $20 million no-bid contract with CEO Barbara Byrd Bennett's former employer. This while the FBI investigates that contract. Shermeen, what impact will this have on CPS and the city?
Well, you know, on the one hand, I do think that there may be some people associated with CPS, such as the unions, the teachers, who may be a little bit relieved that there are components of the CPS budget, the dysfunction of which is getting attention other than the pension issue. You know, it has been the target of nearly anybody who discussed the CPS budget. The pensions, the pensions, the pensions, the pensions. And while I'm not saying that the pensions don't pose any problems, there are these contracts that are being given out to third-party vendors, and it's not just this one $20 million one. There's another $340 million janitorial contract. There's several other contracts to third-party vendors that are, you know, encasing all of these different budgetary issues. So I do think that there might be a little bit of relief for teachers who might actually be convincing the public for the first time that there might need to be reform unrelated to the pensions when we're strictly talking about budgetary issues.
Now, CEO Barbara Byrd Bennett has stepped down. Acting CEO Jesse Ruiz says now there will be no more no-bid contracts at CPS. Lorraine, is this too little too late?
Well, you know, they've already paid the company in question, Soups Academy, $15 million for training that principals by and large said was just worthless and could have been done for much less money by universities in town or other people. I don't know. I mean, it's good that, yes, there's not going to be any more no-bid contracts, but this has been a story that Catalyst wrote about, you know, 2 years ago, and you give someone a $20 million no-bid contract that on its face was, what are you doing? You know, didn't make sense at the time. So
when you look at this and you look at the millions given out in no-bid contracts, how angry should taxpayers be, Caitlin? How concerned should parents be?
Well, I actually did see that a few parent groups have kind of redoubled their efforts to ask Mayor Rahm Emanuel to get rid of the current school board, move to an elected school board. That's been, you know, some people's big rallying cry, and I think this, for them, seems like more proof that that's what's needed, because this board is the one that approved Barbara Byrd Bennett, and she's the one that gave the no contract bid. And it does come down to the taxes that they pay for the schools. You know, this $20 million that is being paid for this contract, you know, came from the CPS budget, which ultimately comes from taxpayers. And so I think that's part of it. And I think the other part of it is sometimes, especially in Illinois or in Chicago, you know, people are going to be especially on edge, watching out for things that seem not quite right. And, you know, we don't know if this wasn't quite right yet. They're still investigating. But there's just a certain sensitivity to, you know, money being spent not the way that people say they want it spent.
You know, some people are suggesting a hybrid board, partly elected, partly appointed. You could even put a student on such a board. There's a couple of cities around the country that have actually implemented this model reasonably successfully. There's concerns with elected boards as well, of course, in terms of political entrapment there.
Yeah, and this board, they could have certainly raised questions about this contract. And at the time it was awarded, the board president, David Vitale, defended it. And when we wrote about it, it kind of became a blip on the radar. And then, the inspector general began looking into it. But they had ample time to question $20 million for principal training on a no-bid contract. And now we see, other recent news emerging about the debt swaps and other things that are going to cost, almost $300 million if they call in payments. I mean, what are we doing? And people want transparency. I think that's what people want. They want to know that their money is going to what it should go to, and more transparency. I think people think with an elected board you'll get more transparency, maybe a hybrid board, I don't know, but people want to know where their money's
To
going.
be clear, all 7 members of the board did vote unanimously for this
Yes.
no-bid contract.
Yes.
And let's talk about some of the other issues CPS is facing. You mentioned the money. Let's also talk about the impact of all this turmoil on the contract with the teachers union that runs out in June. Will it be tougher to avoid another strike or get another contract, Caitlin, with all of this turmoil going on?
Well, I think it's really interesting too because Barbara Byrd Bennett's contract is up at the end of June as well. And she's stepped down for now, and Jesse Ruiz is in the interim position. But there will be a lot of possible changes happening around the same time. So I think that's pretty interesting timing.
I mean, that might be one of the reasons why the governor has been throwing around the bankruptcy word as a negotiation tactic with the unions. I don't believe, maybe I'm wrong, that he's really thinking of bankrupting CPS.
Yeah, as far as I know, the governmental unit can't declare bankruptcy.
There is a law going
yeah.
through Springfield that would allow governmental entities such as CPS to be able to declare bankruptcy and get out from under this debt. But do you see that as a viable solution?
I think that would just anger teachers even more. There's already bad blood between unions and the governor because he wants, to impose right to work. And this is a union that has shown it's not afraid to go out and mobilize or go on strike if they deem it to be. I think declaring bankruptcy would just cause unfortunate chaos, not just with unions, but with, principals and teachers. And then what do? How do you get out from under union contracts, and, what are you going to do next? How are you going to fill the classrooms with teachers? What are you going to do?
And then you worry, if that does happen, then there's 2 things to focus on, which is the bankruptcy and actually running the school district.
Yeah, I think that sometimes there's a mistake in assuming that you can treat a governmental entity exactly as you would a private corporation. And the reason is that when a private corporation declares bankruptcy, actually frequently takes the form of a Chapter 11. And what you do is you just get rid of a number of your creditors and you move on. But in a situation such as CPS, you can't just get rid of a number of your teachers. You actually need them to teach the classes. And then there's the sort of non-financial impact that Lorraine was discussing, which is this is not a private entity, right? This is a public entity that's intended to deliver a public service. And so treating it differently could really compromise the service that's being offered.
We talk about the finances, we talk about the investigation, we talk about these risky debt swaps that the district is involved in that could force repayment of its entire reserve. What does good leadership look like here, and how do you see a way out?
I think that's such a great question. I would say as a mom, it's very disconcerting. I'm one of the lucky moms who actually has the option of either putting her kids in CPS or, trying for a charter school or trying for a private school. And my husband and I are very committed to CPS. We've always been very committed to CPS. We bought our home in a neighborhood with a school that we liked because we thought that we wanted all of our children to go to that school. And I just cringe when I read these articles. And I can't imagine that other parents don't feel the same way. I think at the end of the day, though, we do need to, all of us, roll up our sleeves and get involved, get more involved and let our voices be heard.
Yeah, and there are parents, as you mentioned, across the city who can afford private school, but they're committed to their neighborhood school. And then there are a lot of parents who don't have that option, but they're still citizens. Their kids still need to be educated, and to just toss around, well, bankruptcy, and I don't have any faith in CPS, and don't question $20 million contracts until after the fact, and then, oh, well, we didn't really know what was going on. And, yeah, you did. You were, come on.
Do you think this is enough to make people question that commitment? Will this drive young families from the city or from city schools?
I don't think so. You know, I would say, I think, you know, I don't know Jesse Ruiz very well. I've met him a number of times. I think he's doing his best to do some cleanup right now and to instill the trust. I do think, again, that personally, I think that we need to dedicate ourselves because, as Lorraine said, there are most who don't have the option. And so those of us who do really ought to roll up our sleeves, get engaged, and do our best. You know, some of the reporting work that some of my colleagues at the table have been doing have been instrumental on creating change. So let's allow it to create that change instead of creating a situation that would force a flee.
Right, and what people want, their frustration with government, I don't think is that they want it to be run like a business all the time. They want their dollars spent wisely, and they want to receive a public good. And a public entity like a school system or a court system is not the same as a private business. It's meant to be run for a public good, not for profit. And people want to know that it's being done honestly and efficiently. They don't want to tear it down, and, you know, we want everything to be run like a private business.
All right, we'll switch gears here. We'll move on to a new marijuana prosecution technique. State's Attorney Anita Alvarez announced new plans to prosecute minor drug offenses. Instead of $25,000 fine and up to 3 years in prison, violators get a ticket or referred to a treatment program. The state's attorney says this is not being soft on crime. It's smart. Caitlin, is it?
That's what she's saying. And I saw a study that said nationally, if up to 10% of drug-dependent prisoners, state prisoners, are put through treatment programs, that actually can save up to $5 billion over the long term in terms of health care and, you know, back into the criminal justice system. And of course, that would have to be, you know, translated to a much smaller scale in terms of Cook County. And there's a lot of particulars that, you know, we're not sure if that would make sense here. But I think it's just interesting to see that, you know, that's the kind of idea that she's going for.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that we've had these budget cuts that, you know, targeted human services, which include, you know, drug treatment, and now the state's attorney wants to, and I think it's a good thing, to put low-level drug offenders, give them the option for treatment or send them to treatment. Okay, then we have to spend money on treatment, and that is cheaper than sending them to jail. You know, so.
Yeah, Barbara, the United States has more prisons and more people in prison than any other country in the entire world per capita. This is a staggering statistic. The cost to the taxpayers is incredibly high, and a lot of these prisoners are there for minor drug offenses. And when you really look at the link, for example, between childhood trauma and adulthood addiction, it's a stronger link than obesity and diabetes. I mean, 2/3 of addicts report having been abused as children. These are traumatized people that are, I think addiction is a very serious issue. Substance abuse is a very serious issue. But the war on drugs has not been effective. There aren't fewer people in the prisons, and there aren't fewer users or abusers of controlled substances. So let's just, pure logic, let's try something a little different here and see if it works a little better.
How much of this do you think is about a shift in public attitudes towards marijuana?
I think it kind of follows a similar trend. I mean, a couple of years ago, even smaller amounts of marijuana were given citations and fines instead of arrests. And so I think it kind of follows a pattern that we've been seeing, at least in this area, in the last few years.
Chicago voted in a similar measure about 3 years ago, but a recent study shows it actually resulted in more arrests than tickets, and those who were arrested were predominantly young men of color. Shermeen, what went wrong, and if it didn't work in Chicago, why will it work in wider Cook County?
You know, that's an excellent question. I think the ACLU has also been putting out some really interesting reports on this issue, the racial disparity when it comes to both arrests as well as prosecution for minor drug offenses has been incredible. The racial disparity when it comes to stop and frisk, the ACLU just put out this report that is just absolutely shocking. I do think that the change has to come from the top down. I think it is very difficult to expect I respect them, the young men and women that are in uniforms, police officers on the ground, to suddenly change a culture and an attitude that is incredibly pervasive. The change has to come from the top down, and something that is more streamlined and goes all across the board. For this type of offense, we simply do not put you in prison. We simply refer you to treatment. So let's say then more African Americans are referred to treatment than Caucasians are, but that's still very different than a disproportionate share of African American drug abusers being sent to prison.
Okay, we're going to have to switch gears here. We'll move on to Cardinal Francis George. He was laid to rest today. He died last week at the age of 78 after a long battle with cancer, and he served in Chicago for 17 years before stepping down because of his poor health. Caitlin, what do you think his most enduring legacy is?
Well, I think the community here in Chicago have said that they're excited that he, was from here and that he was able to then go on to lead the community. So I think that they'll always remember him for that.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's always sad when our people who are civic leaders as well as religious leaders die and pass on. But I think that his legacy, as you said, will live on because he was from here and beloved, and we saw that with the mourners coming to pay their respects and all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Cardinal George, an incredible person. When you read his life story and what he overcame and the kindness and the compassion and the missions to the poor, certainly a man to be respected. Of course, his legacy will also include the fact that he was a reasonably conservative member of the church hierarchy. His legacy will include the fact that he opposed the Health Care Reform Act, which he did on the basis of the fact that it provided contraception to women. And he shut down the foster care program of the Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Chicago because of the Illinois state requirement that same-sex couples not be discriminated against as foster parents. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for him and the work that he did, but those of us the advocates in the progressive community are also interested to see a slight change in the Catholic hierarchy going forward.
Broad legacy. We'll shift gears completely. This is a sharp left turn. State lawmakers voted that the state pie should be pumpkin this week. This is a very important piece of legislation. Quickly, favorite pie, and should it be?
You're going to hate me. I don't really like pie.
Oh, no,
I'm more of a chips kind of person.
Oh, my
I'm a salty
goodness.
snack girl.
My favorite, I like pumpkin pie. My favorite pie, though, is sweet potato pie, which also,
So
we
runner-up.
eat. Runner-up. So
I am more of an apple pie person than a pumpkin pie person, but there are a lot of pumpkins grown and processed in Illinois, so it makes sense, but I'm not really a pumpkin pie person.
I'm with you on that one. We'll leave it at that. Charmaine, Lorraine, Caitlin, thank you for spending your time and investing your opinions with us today.